I'm here with Sophia and Gabi. Hello, both of you, dear
Hi,
friends.
all.
We're talking about an Emily Dickinson poem that goes by its first line, There Is Another Loneliness. Sophia, would you read it and then we'll talk about it?
Sure. There is another loneliness that many die without. Not want or friend occasions it, or circumstances of lot. But nature sometimes thought, and whoso it befall, is richer than could be divulged by mortal numeral.
Gabi, what is this thing about? Is there any way to say what it's about?
Yeah, I think, well, to not sound terribly banal, it's about a different kind of loneliness. So not the typical loneliness, which is to say feeling that you don't have friends or a community around you, but something else. And the turn is that loneliness is actually enriching rather than, let's say, negative in some connotation.
Take it from there, Sophia.
Well, what I find kind of interesting about the first line of this poem being there is another loneliness is the assumption that everyone would read loneliness as the same kind to begin with. Like there's no explanation of the principal loneliness that we're supposed to assume
It's
everyone
sort of a
experiences.
rejoinder to an argument or a discussion that's already taken place,
Yeah.
maybe in other poems or before the poem.
Yeah, and it's kind of this assumption that everyone in the world understands the primary kind of loneliness. But then there's another one that not everyone is privy to.
So it's as if she's starting by saying, I'm going to complicate what you already think of. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is that other kind of loneliness that most people don't think about?
I guess just a loneliness I would think there's, as you mentioned, there's a loneliness of not having friends or not having community or whatnot. But another kind of loneliness is someone who still feels lonely in a crowded room, can't relate, has been othered in some sort of way.
Dickinsonian issue, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Gabi, where else does that go?
Well, it says that the things that could occasion that loneliness are nature sometimes, and sometimes thought, which are two very different realms. But to me, it kind of signals that loneliness is maybe something we would call like difference or feeling different from others, either in terms of nature, which we would say like something you didn't choose, something that comes of one's essential being or something like that. And then sometimes thought, where someone goes in their ideas. And for Dickinson, as someone who we know thinks a lot about kind of isolated thought or the abilities of the imagination, like that seems to me in line with that, right? That maybe this kind of loneliness is the kind of thinking through the imagination in a somewhat solitary setting.
Okay, so it, in the third to last line, could refer to nature or thought, but not both because it's a singular. Or it could refer to lot, I don't know, or the need.
I think it's the loneliness.
So it's the other loneliness. Okay, so for the person that is the loneliness befalls, in other words, the loneliness occurs to the person, whoever that is, turns out to be more complicated than could be explained. And that is the metapoetic moment, because this poem is supposedly explaining that thing that cannot, it's an unsayable complication. My reading is probably wrong because of the last line, which identifies the kind of person who cannot discern and divulge. All right, how am I doing, Sophia? Like, where does Emily stand? Where does this poem stand in relation to being able to divulge, describe, discern, and say that complication? Or is this about the unsayable?
I feel like it's unsayable insofar as it's unique to whoever it befalls. It's unsayable because it would be distinct to whoever experiences this other loneliness, which makes it different for whoever has that experience. So it can't be like wrapped up in the singular word of loneliness as we conventionally understand it. If you're lonely, you're alone. But if you have this other loneliness, it's distinct to you because it's interior instead of an exterior circumstance. But you can point toward this general kind of feeling, and I think that's what the poem does.
So in a way, question for both of you, this is kind of, I don't mean to denigrate the poem. I think it's an interesting poem, but this is standard Dickinson, right? I mean, this is what she keeps telling us about. So now it's time for either or both of you just to say what it is that Emily is always reminding us of. It's a different state of mind. It's a neuro difference. It's a fear of even loneliness being socialized in a way that contradicts how she feels. You take over.
Yeah, I think it's in line with the Vesuvius at home idea that one's, even in the kind of isolated imaginary space of the home of writing, there's a kind of worldliness, there's a pushing outwards that is as like lonely as it is expansively not lonely. It's like the opposite of lonely in a way. I think a lot of what we get out of Dickinson as a class is the idea that poetry is creative in the most literal sense, that it kind of creates things even from the fact that we think of it as like a kind of private scene. And so I think there's that, where that loneliness, the isolation, the being one, actually becomes something that couldn't be counted, right? That it is richer than could be divulged by a mortal numeral, rather than the lonely person who says, well, I am one, but if I had 3 friends, well, then we'd be 4, and that would be nice. This is like this is more than that.
Would you like to add to that? My question was, is this a familiar Dickinsonian theme, and what is it?
Well, I think it's definitely a familiar theme in Dickinson. And I think part of that familiarity is, I think richer is interesting here, because I think the poem does, in some sense, say there's some sort of benefit to having this experience of otherness, right? But I don't think she's necessarily claiming that this benefit feels good, but I think she is claiming that it could create a poem. Like, it could create something. That doesn't mean it feels good to experience.
So just to draw out what you're saying, which is a fresh thought about Dickinson. She writes the poems, and the traditional notion is, she's suffering from that other kind of loneliness, and writing poems is therapeutic or a good thing for her. But you're saying what I think we all feel, which is that 1,700 plus times, it never really kind of solved her problem, which is a sociality problem. So that's pretty dramatic and cool, and like, she's really amazing, let's just say. Okay, so I want to go back to whoso it befall, because she's not saying, for me, my experience is too complicated to be divulged or described. She's allowing, at least grammatically, for the possibility that there are others. And of course, that creates a wonderful paradox, that there might be others out there who have the same experience. I mean, if Susan Howe had lived back then, the time that she writes about in My Emily Dickinson, Susan Howe, who's agoraphobic and so forth, would probably be there saying, I am one that this befalls too. Does that create a paradox that there are other Emilys out there that she could connect to? No, of course not.
It's not a It's just a richer house than prose, right? But they're different homes. Because they can't leave.
And they don't connect, right? You can't leave. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a sort of funny tension in the poem about that. Like, the word loneliness is capitalized, not a surprising thing in Dickinson, but its capitalization as a sort of noun makes it generic. It makes it like there's a genre of loneliness. It's not Emily's loneliness, but it is Emily's loneliness, but it's a category of a kind of loneliness. And the phrase befall is interesting here because befall for me sounds like a chance operation, right? Like it befell me, I didn't choose it, this is what happened, yeah. And that seems like, what I can't tell is the loneliness that we're talking about versus the standard loneliness. She says, in our case, this is not occasioned by circumstances a lot. So it makes it sound like it's not about chance fate. But then she says nature sometimes brings it on, and it can befall someone. So I'm a little like unsure if the poem can dictate sort of like, is this kind of loneliness something that comes to someone unbidden, like just out of nowhere, but essentially them? Or is it something one kind of comes into and nourishes? And I don't know, and I'm not sure if the poem knows, but I like that we're in something about nature versus, I don't know, I don't want to say nature versus nurture, but nature versus some other thing for where this other loneliness comes from.
I think I agree with you, and I think she's further distancing herself from any kind of activity or volition that would do any of the work that is required to get out of what befalls you. So richer than could be divulged is a very passive, deliberately passive way of saying, who is it that would, it would be a mortal numeral, which is also very vague. So richer than could be divulged. She's not saying it's more complicated than I, the speaker of this poem, or the writer, Emily Dickinson, would want to try to divulge in a 8-line ballad, because the ballad can't handle such a profound thing. So I am going to just stipulate that it can't be described by anyone, and I'm not going to do that here, even though that's what this poem is about. All right, final question, and then we'll do final words. Okay, the ballad. There is another loneliness that many die without, nor want a friend occasions it of circumstances of lot. Okay, that last line doesn't quite do the ballad, but
well,
it's
maybe with the different accent.
yeah, circumstances of lot. But anyway, I love the next line for ballad. But nature sometimes thought, and whoso it befall is richer than could be divulged. Okay, that's hard. By mortal numeral. Okay, it's very ballady. Can ballad sustain such a thing? This is the question, always.
I mean, can. I mean, did.
Did, here, yes.
The Dickinsonian operation, I think, is that ending M dash, right? That M dash carries up the kind of unsaid that is beyond the poem or that couldn't be divulged or something like that. There's a lot, I think, held into how short this poem is and how briefly it ends. And I don't know, that's very standard to Dickinson, right? To end in a kind of unending, but even though it ends in this nice end rhyme with befall, it feels interminable in some way.
All right, final thoughts. Anything at all? Sophia, you're first.
Well, I'm thinking about this makes me think a lot about anxiety, but nature sometimes thought, nature as in one's own nature, a body composition kind of understanding of what nature means, or thought, spiraling out into your own thoughts. And I feel like the other loneliness isn't necessarily in opposition to our conventionally understood notion of loneliness. I feel like they're holding hands almost in this poem, and that one can kind of beget the other, but there's a shadow behind the big capital L loneliness, and that's where the smaller one, the other one, is hidden. And so I just find, I don't feel like this is a poem about opposition. I feel like this is a poem about digging into why that loneliness happens.
All right. Nice. Thank you. Gabi?
I hope you'll let me be terribly academic for a second, because I think another way of reading this poem is through psychoanalysis, around, we've been talking, Sophia used the word otherness a lot, and the other in kind of the psychoanalytic version of it is that thing that feels incoherent and interrupts your version of reality that seems outside of your whole envisioned world. And I think about the other in somebody like Lacan is called similar to the real or the zero, that thing that breaks you out of cohesion. And so for me, ending with this, it's richer than could be divulged by mortal numeral. I think the first loneliness, the loneliness that we're not talking about, is the one, right? I am one and I should be many. But I feel this other loneliness is something it's zero. It's outside of numeration, but therefore richer because it's kind of engaged with this whole different incoherence or something that I think there's a version of this poem that thinks of that loneliness not as just Dickinson's stylistic loneliness, hey, I'm an iconoclast, I'm doing something interesting and people aren't getting it, but rather thinks of Dickinson is trying to get at something that is ineffable or not writable, and struggling with it.
Which is really a modern problem for a poet.
So.
And it is a post-Freudian or after Freud's time, and she's pre-Freudian. So I think you're right. I think she really is doing something new, and it wasn't terribly academic. It was just it sounded like if you hadn't said that, people would say, "Oh, that's Gabi, a Mod Po video, doing what Gabi does." Okay, my final thought follows. So we started with Sophia's really smart, characteristically smart comment about in media res, there's another loneliness. So there's the loneliness that is stipulated, that is off stage, that is all that's going on. Everybody's talking about it. And that's the thing. That's the groovy loneliness, the current loneliness that I'm not interested in. And this makes me think that this is a poem that has a comment on the poetic tradition. I think it's an anti-romanticist poem. It's a poem that says, oh, I am so tired of being lonely as a cloud. Like that is not the kind of loneliness I have ever experienced. I don't know where the fuck you came up with that. And so all the other poems are off stage. All the other poems about loneliness are over there. And I am responding monumentally, massively in this tiny little ballad. There is another one. And maybe I'm the only one who has to suffer enough to understand why all that loneliness has to be off stage. And so I want to continue the argument. And I want to continue it as an argument against all the other poems that think they've solved the problem of loneliness. And I am not going to solve it. I'm going to write about it, but I won't solve it because that's what you want me to do. You want me to talk about how lonely I am. And I'm not writing about that. I'm writing about how that problem is unsolvable. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. You
Lonely as a cloud. That was good.
Lonely. I pulled out lonely
Yeah,
as a
you did.
cloud.
No, that's a good reference.
All right. Thank you both.
Thank you
Sophia,
all.
Thank
Gabi.
you.